Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this series of videos, I'm here to give you as much advice as I can about characterization. In the previous installment, I covered the basics and went over a number of ways in which a character can be compelling, including some cases where the reader might find the character interesting, even though they wouldn't want to be friends with them. And today, that is the area I want to focus on, the question of morally gray characters and just moral complexity in general. Because this is a topic that hits really close to home for a lot of readers. If you go on platforms like Reddit or TikTok or YouTube, you will find any number of discussions about how character X from series Y is a terrible person actually, where people will be enthusiastically debating and analyzing the actions of said character as if they were a flesh and blood human being who actually did all of those things on their own volition, rather than the figment of an author's imagination who only ever does, thinks, and feels anything because the author decided that they should. And I do not claim to be an exception to this. I was supposed to record this video last week, but I kept having to rewrite my script because over and over I found myself editorializing about morality in general, rather than talking about morality in fiction. And what this highlights for you as a writer is that morality is an extremely effective way of making a character feel like a flesh and blood human being, more so than any amount of background information or lore. Now, even if we completely ignore all other forms of literature and only focus on long-form written prose, the history of moral complexity in fiction still goes back hundreds of years. You have your 16th century picaresque novels about roguish heroes outsmarting a corrupt society. You have your Bildungsromans about characters learning to navigate a morally challenging world. You have your tragic and aloof Byronic heroes, Russian Romanticism, all the way up to and beyond the 20th century with things like crime fiction and, of course, my pet genre of noir. So I think we can agree I'm not going to be able to cover all the nuances of this subject in a couple of YouTube videos, because this is definitely going to be a multi-parter. But what I can do is talk about some of the methods and approaches that you have at your disposal and some of the challenges you might face while executing them. But before I go into any specifics, there is one thing I want to make clear, which, if you've been following this channel for a while, should be nothing new. Namely, that I do not believe in silver bullets. What this means is that I am not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't write. Instead, I'm here to ask the questions that will hopefully encourage you to think about your story in a deeper and more comprehensive way so that you can write the most fully realized version of it. So with that in mind, let's get started. The first question is, once again, something that is going to be familiar to returning viewers, namely, what kind of story are you trying to tell? One of the great powers of fiction is that it allows us to safely explore themes and ideas that we wouldn't be able to do so in the real world, at least not without causing significant harm to ourselves or others. Basically, every little story gets to be its own thought experiment. And specifically, when it comes to morality, fiction allows us to dig into some really deep and oftentimes really uncomfortable recesses of the human psyche. And so the question is, are you digging just to see what you find, or is there something that you're specifically looking for? In more concrete terms, is your story telling the reader, here's a bunch of people with their own motivations and their own agendas, and you get to decide which of them are good or bad? Or are you trying to make a specific point and taking sides? Mind you, as with so many other things, this isn't something that you absolutely have to decide in advance before you start writing. Even if you're a planner who works from a strict outline, these themes often arise very organically as you follow along with your character's actions and their consequences. So what I can recommend is that you keep this question at the back of your mind, at least when you start doing your revisions, so that you can keep an eye out for opportunities to explore these kinds of topics. And the other main question, which kind of follows from the first one, is what is the source of moral complexity in your story? Now, there are a bunch of options that you can choose here, and I'm going to cover 3 of them in this video, which are by no means mutually exclusive. The first one of these is when the moral conflict is purely intrinsic to the character. That is to say, you have a person who does some good things and some bad things. And it's important to emphasize that in this case, we're only looking at scenarios where the character does have the option to do a good thing or at least avoid doing the bad thing. Nobody is forcing them to do a bad thing. They are not risking losing anything by doing the good thing. It is purely up to their choice. These kinds of stories tend to work as character studies. Who is this person? Why do they make these choices? How do they affect the people around them? And how are they affected by other people's reactions to their choices? There is definitely room to address some broader societal issues as you dig into the character's backstory and their upbringing and the influences that shape their personality, but predominantly these stories are going to be very personal and intimate. And you're going to have three main challenges when pulling this off. The first one is that you need to create a character who can believably make all of those good and bad choices. And one good way of accomplishing this is when all of those choices are expressions of the same underlying personality traits. For example, a character who wants to be loved might be, very kind and helpful and selfless, but they might also become possessive or clingy from time to time. The explanation for their choices doesn't have to be immediately obvious, but it does need to eventually make sense. If you have a character who is a cold-blooded killer who has slaughtered dozens, if not hundreds of people, and all of a sudden they just randomly decide to have mercy on one specific person who happens to become their love interest later, that's not moral complexity, that is just very convenient writing. It can still be a good story, it's just probably not going to be morally interesting. The second challenge is one of pacing. The fundament of many of these stories is that they allow the reader to get to know the character in a particular light and form a certain impression, and then either show the character doing something or reveal something about their past, which calls this impression into question and makes the reader conflicted. So the question is, at what point should you reveal some detail that seemingly contradicts the reader's impression of the character? Because on the one hand, the longer you wait, the more familiar the character will feel, and so when you reveal something compromising about them, it can feel much more like a personal betrayal. But on the other hand, there's also the risk that your revelation simply won't feel impactful enough, and therefore it will fail to make any meaningful dent in that impression. It'll basically feel like a drop of water in a bucket, and the reader will just kind of shrug it off, like, yeah, okay, this isn't great, but, they're still a good person. And the third challenge is going to be one of trajectory. Because if your character does some good things and some bad things, well, that inherently creates conflict. And in fiction, readers are sort of trained to expect resolution to conflicts. So as the author, you will need to consider whether you want to grant that resolution to the reader or withhold it. And if you do grant a resolution, what note do you want to leave the reader on and how much you want to commit? Okay, so those were the stories with intrinsic moral conflict. So let's now talk about stories with extrinsic moral conflict. These are the ones where you have a character with strong moral convictions who are repeatedly put into situations that challenge those convictions. As you can probably tell from that description alone, many of these stories tend to be classic hero versus the world affairs that are often used to explore clashing ideologies or interrogate questions about social structures, tradition, peer pressure, and so on. Still, just like how stories with intrinsic moral conflict can still address societal issues, stories with extrinsic moral conflict can still be made personal. And this is actually where your first challenge comes from. Namely, that developing your character for this kind of story can be something of a balancing act. Because on the one hand, if you focus entirely on the societal question, then your main character can very easily end up as a sort of hollow stereotype, which in turn can lead to your story feeling a bit polemic or preachy. But on the other hand, if you put a lot of effort into developing your character and making their moral struggle very personal, your reader might still find them compelling, but they might also lose a little bit of relatability. So instead of identifying with your character's struggles, your reader will just end up saying, wow, yeah, sucks to be you. Which, again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just goes all the way back to our original question of what kind of story are you trying to tell, and are you trying to make any specific point that you want your reader to identify with? The second challenge is once again going to be one of pacing, but this time in a different way. A lot of stories with an extrinsic moral conflict are all about gradual escalation. Very often, things will start completely innocent and innocuous. In fact, the character may not even realize that they're doing things that are against their values. If they do realize, they might be in denial for a while. They can tell themselves this is no big deal, or that this is for some greater cause. More on that a bit later. Either way, the story becomes a question of how far does this person allow themselves to be pushed until they reach some sort of breaking point where they have to face the facts and do something about this conflict. But as almost always, that is not your only option. You can also have a story where a character comes in with a strong set of moral convictions that immediately get reality checked, and from then on, the story is essentially about the character trying and usually failing with different ways of processing and resolving this conflict internally or externally. However you go about it, pacing is extremely important in that you have to create peaks and valleys of intensity so that your character has time to reflect, because those are also going to be the times when your reader gets a chance to reflect. And the reason this is important is because if you want your reader to be repeatedly conflicted about their opinion, you have to give them a chance to form an opinion first. And thirdly, besides intrinsic and extrinsic moral complexity, we have the ones that lie somewhere in between, one of which is the conflict between the means and the end. This is where you have people doing good things for a bad reason or bad things for a good reason. The first of these is admittedly rarer, probably because it's generally considered less interesting, which I think is unfortunate. A couple of years ago, I remember being a beta reader for a fantasy novel called Her Time, which, as far as I can tell, still hasn't been released yet, which, in my opinion, is a crying shame because it has one of the most interesting antagonists I have ever read. Without going into too much detail, just in case the author does decide to publish it, the antagonist is a person who has risen to considerable political power, and he's doing things that are genuinely beneficial for the entire country, but he's doing them for all of the worst, most selfish reasons. But yes, more often than not, you're going to have people who do bad things for the sake of some sort of noble cause. And what's interesting about these characters from a sort of meta-narrative point of view is that these people are essentially convinced that they are the heroes of a story about an extrinsic moral conflict. They have pure and honest and noble intentions, and it is only the cruel world that is constantly preventing them from accomplishing those goals in non-violent or non-harmful ways. With this kind of character, you're going to have two main challenges, and neither of those are pacing. The first one is that if you want this kind of character to be really effective, at some point you have to prove them right. If you have, for example, a villain who insists that they only want what's best for the world and all they do is kill people and spread misery, then once again, that character isn't complex, they are delusional at best, or take everyone for an idiot at worst. If you want your reader to feel genuinely conflicted, then you need to give this character a legitimate success. Show your reader that, yes, their methods are unsavory, but they unquestionably produce results, maybe even results that couldn't be accomplished otherwise. And the second challenge is that after you've proven your character right, you need to decide if ultimately you want to prove them wrong. And once again, this goes all the way back to our initial question. Do you want to simply present this character objectively and tell the reader, look, you agree with their cause, but not with their methods, but you see they work, make up your own mind? Or do you want to ultimately show the reader that this character is in the wrong? Because if you do, make sure that the argument you present is inherent to the character's philosophy. As a sort of high-level example, let's say you have a villain who insists that they want to solve some sort of widespread societal problem. They have shown their success, and both the hero and the reader are kind of on the verge of agreeing with them, and then the villain suddenly decides to shoot the hero's love interest for reasons that are completely unrelated to the underlying moral conflict. And this is what eventually convinces the hero not to take their side. The potential problem with this kind of resolution is that this only proves that the villain specifically is a bad person, but it doesn't disprove what they stand for, which, again, depending on the kind of story you want to tell, might be counterproductive to the point you're trying to make. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments below. Like I said, there will be a follow-up to this video, hopefully released within a reasonable time. And until then, stay tuned.